Yes, but you have to try very hard to do that. So with Grok, we've tried very hard to get Grok to get to the truth of things, and it's only really recently that we've been able to have some breakthroughs on that front, and it's taken an immense amount of effort for us to overcome basically.
A question gets typed into an AI system. Simple, direct, unafraid. Someone asks Grok, Elon Musk's artificial intelligence, what the Ethiopian Bible says about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The answer does not come back the way most people expect. Not because the AI makes something up, not because it invents a mystery that does not exist, but because the honest answer, the factually accurate, historically grounded answer, turns out to be more layered than almost anyone raised on a Western Bible has ever been told. Here is what most people in America do not know. The Bible they grew up reading is not the only Bible. It is not the oldest preserved canon. And it is not the canon that kept the most books. Hi, viewers. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something personal. What is the oldest version of the Bible you have ever held, read, or even heard of? Drop it in the comments right now, because your answer is going to matter before this documentary is over. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has been reading a Bible with 81 books for over 1,500 years. The Protestant Bible has 66. The Catholic Bible has 73. That difference is not a footnote. That difference contains entire books, entire frameworks for understanding who Jesus was, what death meant, and what resurrection actually looked like to the people who first believed it happened. One of those extra books is the Book of Enoch. And the Book of Enoch does not just add color to the resurrection story. It adds a layer of the universe most Western Christians have never been asked to look at. The question Grok was asked seems simple on the surface. But underneath it sits 1,500 years of preserved manuscripts, ancient councils that made decisions the public never fully understood, and a tradition of Christian faith that survived in East Africa, while the rest of the world argued over which books to keep. Something is buried inside that story, something documented, something real. And before this is over, the most unsettling discovery will not come from an AI. It will come from a page that has been sitting in plain sight for centuries, read by millions, understood by very few. There is a reason this question about the Ethiopian Bible and the resurrection has traveled across the internet faster than almost any other biblical topic in recent memory. It is not because people are looking for conspiracy. It is because people are hungry for something they cannot quite name. A missing layer, a sealed room, a part of the house they have lived in their whole lives that they were never shown. The resurrection of Jesus Christ sits at the center of Christian faith. The Apostle Paul makes this explicit in his first letter to the Corinthians. He writes that if Christ has not been raised, then faith itself is empty. That is not a side argument. That is the core. Remove the resurrection, and the entire structure of Christian belief comes down. So when a question surfaces, a real question, with real historical weight behind it, about whether the Ethiopian Bible preserves a dimension of that resurrection story that the Western world quietly set aside, the stakes are not academic. They are personal, theological, and for millions of people, they feel urgent. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is one of the oldest, continuously practicing Christian institutions on earth. Its roots trace back to the 4th century, to the conversion of the Aksumite Empire under King Ezana. That is not mythology. That is documented in inscriptions, in coins, in centuries of unbroken liturgical tradition. This is not a fringe tradition. This is a church that predates the Protestant Reformation by more than 1,000 years. A church that preserved manuscripts the rest of the world lost, discarded, or never knew existed. Mel Gibson has spoken publicly about making a film on the resurrection. Joe Rogan has hosted long conversations about what early Christianity actually looked like before the councils and the creeds. And now, an AI system trained on more human knowledge than any library in history has been asked to look directly at the Ethiopian tradition and answer a question most Western seminaries never put on the curriculum. What comes next is not what the viral headline promised. It is heavier, it is older, and it does not need exaggeration to matter. Open the Book of Enoch to chapter 1. The first line does not begin with a genealogy or a greeting. It begins with a vision of what Enoch calls the Holy and Great One, coming from his dwelling with 10,000 of his holy ones to execute judgment on all. That text is quoted almost word for word in the New Testament, in the book of Jude, verses 14 and 15. Jude, a canonical book accepted by virtually every Christian tradition on earth, reaches into Enoch and pulls that passage into the New Testament as testimony.
I mean, let's just say, I agree with the principles that Jesus advocated, and there's great wisdom in the teachings of Jesus, and I agree with those teachings.
This is not speculation. The linguistic parallel is documented. Scholars across multiple institutions, including the University of Edinburgh, Harvard Divinity School, and the Dead Sea Scrolls research centers, have confirmed the textual relationship between Jude and the Ethiopic Book of Enoch. The manuscript that best preserves the complete Book of Enoch is the Ethiopic version, known in the scholarly world as 1 Enoch. It survived intact inside the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, while Greek and Latin versions fragmented or disappeared. The Ethiopic language Ge'ez has its own word for what happens at the resurrection. The term used in Ethiopian liturgical texts for Christ's rising is not a borrowed Greek construction. It carries a meaning that encompasses not just physical rising from death, but a cosmic realignment, a reordering of what the ancient world called the unseen realm. That same concept appears in the Hebrew word for the resurrection of the dead, Tekiyat Hamatim, which carries layered meaning across the rabbinic tradition. It means not just that a body rises, but that something fundamental about the created order is reversed. Death undone, the curse suspended, the structure of the fallen world interrupted at its root. Now consider what 3 separate ancient traditions confirm independently. The Ethiopic preservation of Enoch describes a cosmic judgment involving angelic beings and a final restoration. The Jewish apocalyptic tradition describes resurrection as cosmic reversal. And the New Testament itself, in Paul and Peter and Jude, uses language that only fully makes sense when placed beside those older frameworks. 3 independent streams. Same framework, same structure, same cosmology of resurrection as something that happens not just in a garden tomb in Jerusalem, but across layers of a universe most modern readers were never taught to see. The Council of Laodicea met in 363 AD. Among its decisions was a narrowed list of approved books. The Book of Enoch did not make that list. Ethiopia did not accept that narrowing. And what Ethiopia kept, the Western Church largely stopped reading. That decision made in a room of bishops over 1,600 years ago is what makes the next question unavoidable. What exactly did the West stop reading? And why does it still matter? Pull up the Ethiopian Orthodox biblical canon and set it beside the standard Protestant Old Testament. Count the books. The difference is not a rounding error, it is a library. The Ethiopian canon includes the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah, the Shepherd of Hermas in some liturgical traditions. These are not fringe texts preserved in caves by isolated communities. These are books the Ethiopian Orthodox Church reads, chants, and teaches within a living, unbroken worship tradition that stretches back 16 centuries. Now look at the resurrection narrative through that wider frame. In the standard Western Gospel accounts, Jesus dies on Friday, the tomb is sealed. On Sunday morning, women arrive and find it empty. Angels speak. Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, then to the disciples, then to 500 witnesses, according to Paul. That sequence is documented, verified, consistent across multiple independent sources: Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, and Paul's letters in Corinthians. But here is what the Ethiopian canon adds to the background of that story. Not to the events, to the cosmology behind the events. The Book of Enoch describes a layered universe.
The Middle East.
The guy that owns satellites, AI, and all this, having that guy leaning towards, he talked about a creator last week. He's talking about Jesus because, undoubtedly, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, whatever, Jesus Christ was here. That's full stop.
A realm above the earth where angelic beings operate. A realm beneath what Enoch calls Sheol in some passages, where the spirits of the dead wait. And a divine judgment that moves through both realms, not just the visible one. When Luke records that two men in dazzling clothes stand inside the empty tomb, he uses language that in Enoch's framework is not metaphorical. It is cosmological. Angels do not appear in the Ethiopian interpretive tradition simply as messengers in white robes. They are beings whose presence signals that the boundary between the seen and unseen realms has been crossed, and crossed by divine authority, not natural process. The first letter of Peter, chapter 3, verses 18 through 20, contains one of the most puzzling passages in the entire New Testament. It says that after Christ was put to death in the body, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits. Modern Western commentaries argue endlessly about what that means. Some call it metaphorical. Some call it a reference to Noah's generation. Some simply move past it. In the Ethiopian interpretive tradition read alongside Enoch, that passage is not a puzzle. It fits exactly into a cosmology where unseen realms exist, where spirits are imprisoned pending judgment, and where the resurrection of Christ is an event that reverberates not just in a tomb in Jerusalem, but through layers of a universe structured precisely the way Enoch described it. That is not a fictional addition. That is a documented interpretive tradition, preserved in a church older than most Western denominations, reading books that the Western canon quietly shelved. The surface-level resurrection story has not changed. The tomb is still empty. The witnesses are still real. The gospel accounts are still intact. But the room behind the room, the cosmological framework that the first believers may have been reading the resurrection through, is still sitting in an Ethiopic manuscript, largely unread by the Western world. And what that framework reveals about a specific set of New Testament passages that most pastors skip over entirely, that is where this investigation is about to go. There is a passage in the 6th chapter of Genesis that has never been fully resolved. 2 verses, 40 words in most English translations. And for centuries, biblical scholars have disagreed sometimes sharply about what those words actually mean. The text says that the sons of God saw the daughters of humans, that they were beautiful, and they took wives from among them. Then it says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. Sons of God, Nephilim, 2 terms. No full explanation. Genesis moves on almost immediately, as if the writer expected the reader to already know the backstory. The Book of Enoch provides that backstory in extraordinary detail. Enoch identifies the sons of God as the Watchers, a class of angelic beings assigned to observe humanity. He records their names. He records their descent to a mountain called Hermon. He records what they taught humanity: metalworking, herbalism, enchantments, and knowledge of signs in the sky. And he records the judgment that followed, a judgment involving flood, imprisonment, and a promised final reckoning. This is not mythology invented in isolation. Fragments of the Book of Giants, a text connected to the Enochic tradition, were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, discovered in 1947, verified by multiple institutions. The Qumran community, likely Essene, was reading Enoch-connected material as authoritative scripture in the 1st century BC, the same century that produced John the Baptist, Jesus of Nazareth, and the earliest disciples. Now, place that framework beside the resurrection. Paul writes in his letter to the Colossians, chapter 2, verse 15, that through the cross, Christ disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public spectacle of them. The Greek words used archai and exousiai refer in the 1st century Jewish cosmological vocabulary to precisely the kind of beings Enoch describes. Not human rulers, spiritual authorities, powers operating in unseen realms, Paul is describing the crucifixion and resurrection as a cosmic event, a power transfer.
Enoch descends into the pit. He descends into the pit where the spirits are imprisoned. And he tells them what? No, you're doomed. God is not going to forgive you. You're going to be here until the end of days.
A disarmament of forces the modern Western Church has largely stopped naming. The Ethiopian tradition never stopped naming them. The Ethiopian liturgical framework for understanding what Christ defeated at the resurrection includes not just sin and death in the abstract, but the specific structures of the unseen realm described in Enoch, in Jubilees, and in the Ascension of Isaiah. This is why the question asked of Grok about the Ethiopian Bible and the resurrection returns an answer that lands harder than a simple yes or no, because the honest answer requires looking at a cosmological framework that the Western Church inherited, then quietly dismantled, without ever fully explaining why. Mel Gibson has said in public interviews that his planned resurrection film would explore what happened between the cross and the empty tomb, between death and reappearance. That interval, traditionally called the harrowing of hell in Western theology, is precisely where the Enochic framework and the Ethiopian interpretive tradition become most relevant. What Christ did in those hours, according to Peter, involved proclamation to imprisoned spirits. According to Paul, it involved the disarmament of cosmic authorities. According to the Ethiopian theological tradition, reading Enoch as canon, it involved the reversal of a cosmic disorder that began in Genesis 6. That is not an AI generating drama. That is 3 separate sources, 1 canonical New Testament letter, 1 Pauline epistle, and 1 ancient preserved tradition pointing at the same event from 3 different angles. And there is one more angle, one that most Western readers have passed over without stopping. A single verse in the Gospel of Matthew that may be the most cosmologically dense sentence in the entire New Testament. It has been sitting there, printed in every Bible, for 2,000 years. Almost no one asks what it means. Matthew 27, verses 52 and 53. Read it slowly. The tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. That is in the Gospel of Matthew, canonical scripture, accepted by every major Christian tradition on earth. And it describes a mass resurrection event, multiple bodies, multiple appearances, multiple witnesses in Jerusalem that virtually no Western sermon series has ever fully addressed. Not one verse before it, not one verse after it. Matthew records it and moves on. No names, no follow-up, no explanation of who these holy people were, where they went, or what happened to them. Just the fact, placed inside the Passion narrative, surrounded by earthquakes and a torn temple curtain and a Roman centurion who looks at the cross and says, "Truly this was the Son of God." This passage has troubled biblical scholars for centuries, not because they doubt it is there. It is there, in the Greek text, in every manuscript tradition, but because it sits in the middle of the most documented event in the ancient world and still raises a question that no Western theological tradition has fully answered. What exactly happened at the moment of the resurrection that caused tombs to open? The Ethiopian interpretive tradition, reading Enoch alongside the Gospels, does not treat that question as unanswerable. The Enochic framework describes the resurrection as a cosmic boundary event, a moment where the structure separating the living from the dead, the seen from the unseen, is interrupted by divine authority, not symbolically, structurally. And when that boundary breaks, it breaks in multiple directions simultaneously. That framework makes Matthew 27 legible in a way that centuries of purely Western commentary have struggled to achieve. Now here is where the investigation turns. Because if the Ethiopian tradition preserves a cosmological framework that makes the New Testament's own most puzzling passages more coherent, not less, then the question is no longer just about what Ethiopia kept. The question becomes, why did the Western Church stop reading it? If you have ever read Matthew 27 and stopped at those 2 verses wondering what you just read, drop a comment below right now.
Death and resurrection celebrated by Easter, and it is time for us to wake up, become conscious, and recognize it as such. It is not possible to encapsulate within any finite written account the total import of the idea of Christ's death and rebirth. The impossible claim of the bodily resurrection of one man,
Because what comes next explains something that most Bible teachers never discuss in public. The answer to that question reaches back to a room in the 4th century where a decision was made, a documented, historically verified decision, that quietly changed what 1 billion Christians would spend the next 1,600 years reading, and the full weight of that decision has never been more visible than it is right now. In 367 AD, a bishop named Athanasius of Alexandria wrote a letter. It was his annual festal letter, the 39th in a series he sent every year to announce the date of Easter. But inside that letter, he included something that had nothing to do with Easter. He included a list of the books he considered canonical, the books he believed should be read in churches as authoritative scripture, and the books he believed should not. That list, from a single bishop and a single letter and a single year, became one of the most influential documents in the history of Western Christianity. It was not a council decision. It was not a universal vote. It was one man's letter. And the 27 books of the New Testament that Athanasius listed in 367 AD are almost exactly the 27 books that appear in Protestant Bibles today. The Book of Enoch is not on that list. Athanasius calls certain books, including Enoch, useful for instruction but not canonical. That distinction sounds minor. It is not. Once a book is classified as non-canonical in a tradition, it stops being copied in that tradition's monasteries. It stops being taught in that tradition's schools. Within a few generations, it effectively disappears from that tradition's theology. In Egypt and the Greek-speaking churches, that is what happened to Enoch. Copying slowed, teaching stopped. The complete text vanished from Western libraries for over 1,000 years. Ethiopia did not follow that narrowing. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church operates under its own theological authority. It did not take its canon from Athanasius. It did not take it from the Council of Laodicea in 363 AD, which produced its own restricted list. Ethiopia's canon developed within its own ecclesiastical tradition, rooted in the Aksumite Church of the 4th century, and it kept what Alexandria later set aside. This is not a conspiracy. There was no secret meeting where Western bishops agreed to suppress dangerous knowledge. The process was slower and more ordinary than that, and in some ways, more troubling. Books get dropped from canons through a combination of theological preference, political pressure, manuscript survival rates, and the simple institutional inertia of powerful churches deciding what their clergy will and will not study. Enoch survived in Ethiopia because Ethiopia was outside the orbit of those institutional decisions. The manuscripts copied in Giez, in Highland monasteries, in a church that had already been Christian for centuries. Before Augustine wrote a single word, those manuscripts kept being copied because the tradition that valued them never stopped. In 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce returned from Ethiopia carrying 3 complete Ethiopic manuscripts of the Book of Enoch. It was the first time the complete text of 1 Enoch had been available in Europe in over a millennium. When scholars began translating it, they found something that should have generated enormous theological discussion. They found that the New Testament authors knew this book, not vaguely, not distantly. They knew it closely enough to quote it, echo it, and build arguments on its cosmological framework. Jude quotes it directly. Peter's language in his first letter maps onto Enochic cosmology with a precision that is not coincidental. Paul's vocabulary for the powers and authorities that Christ defeated at the resurrection, archai, exousiai, cosmocratores, fits the Enochic framework for the structure of the unseen realm with a specificity that demands explanation. The Western Church had access to all of that. It set it aside. and for 1,600 years, the Ethiopian Church kept reading. That is not a suppressed secret. It is a documented historical divergence. A fork in the road taken quietly, over decades, by powerful institutions making decisions that felt reasonable at the time and look considerably more significant from here. What Bruce brought back from Ethiopia in 1773 did not shock the church into revision. It moved slowly into academic journals and footnotes and specialized commentaries most believers never read. Until now, when a viral question typed into an AI sent millions of people looking at a tradition they had never been told existed. And what those people found when they looked
of the Gospels and the Book of Revelation. The idea of the Son of Man, for example, which appears in the Gospel of Mark, shares theological similarities with 1st Enoch. The last book of the New Testament, Revelation, closely resembles the apocalypse of the Book of the Parables, since both describe a throne room apocalypse partnered with a final judgment.
Is exactly what the next part of this investigation is about to confirm. In 2023, Elon Musk launched XAI and introduced Grok to the public. It is a real product. It runs on real data. And like every large language model trained on human knowledge, it has been asked questions that no search engine was ever built to handle. The question about the Ethiopian Bible and the resurrection of Jesus is one of them. Here is what makes that moment significant. Not as a technology story, but as a cultural signal. When millions of people use an AI to ask a question about ancient scripture, it means the question has already been forming in their minds for a long time. The AI did not create the curiosity. It gave the curiosity a place to go. That curiosity has been building through multiple channels simultaneously. Mel Gibson has stated publicly, in multiple interviews, that he intends to make a sequel to The Passion of the Christ focused on the resurrection. He has described wanting to portray what happened in the interval between the crucifixion and the empty tomb. That interval, what Christian theology calls the descent, is precisely the territory that Enochic cosmology and the Ethiopian interpretive tradition illuminate most directly. Gibson's public statements have not been dismissed as fringe. They have generated serious coverage in mainstream entertainment media and renewed public conversation about what the resurrection actually involved beyond the empty tomb and the appearances. Joe Rogan has hosted conversations on his podcast, one of the most widely listened to programs in the United States, about early Christianity, manuscript history, and the question of whether the Bible modern readers hold represents the complete picture of what early believers knew and taught. Those conversations have reached audiences that no seminary lecture ever would. And they have sent millions of people searching. They are searching for the same thing the Ethiopian tradition preserved. Not a secret, not a hidden gospel that overturns everything, something more disorienting than that. A cosmological background, an unseen realm framework that makes the New Testament's own language about angels, principalities, powers, imprisoned spirits, and cosmic disarmament makes sense in the way the first century readers would have understood it. Because the first century readers were not reading Paul's letters cold. They were reading them inside a world saturated with the language and cosmology of Jewish apocalyptic thought, a world where Enoch was widely known, where Genesis 6 raised questions everyone was discussing, where the idea that unseen powers operated above and beneath the visible world was not mysticism but cosmology. Modern Western Christianity largely lost that background. Ethiopia kept it. And now, in 2024 and 2025, as AI systems get asked ancient questions and popular culture rediscovers forgotten traditions, that background is coming back into view. Not through a single shocking answer from a machine, through the slow, undeniable weight of evidence that was always there in manuscripts, in canonical letters, in the Gospel of Matthew's most overlooked 2 verses, waiting for someone to stop scrolling long enough to actually read it. The question is no longer whether this tradition exists. It does. The documentation is overwhelming. The question is what it means for the resurrection, for the canon, and for the millions of people who are only now discovering that the Bible they read their whole lives was always sitting beside a larger conversation they were never invited into? That answer lives in the oldest layer of this investigation, and it lands harder than anything the viral headline promised. Here is the full weight of what this investigation has confirmed. The resurrection of Jesus Christ, documented in the Gospels, argued by Paul in Corinthians, witnessed by hundreds of named and unnamed individuals, is not made more credible by the Ethiopian tradition. It does not need the Book of Enoch to stand. The eyewitness accounts are intact. The manuscript tradition is among the best attested in all of ancient literature. The empty tomb is reported by sources hostile to the claim. The resurrection stands on its own historical testimony. But here is what the Ethiopian tradition does. It restores the cosmological background that the first believers were reading the resurrection through, and that restoration changes the scale of what the resurrection means. In the framework preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, reading Enoch alongside the Gospels and the letters of Paul, the resurrection is not only the reversal of one man's death, it is the reversal of a cosmic disorder that began before the flood, before the Nephilim, before the events of Genesis 6 that the Western Church spent centuries trying to explain away. Paul writes in Colossians that on the cross, Christ made a public spectacle of the rulers and authorities, the archai and exousiai, leading them in a triumphal procession. That language is Roman imperial language. It describes what a conquering general does with defeated enemies. Paul is saying that the resurrection is not a private spiritual event. It is a public cosmic victory visible to the unseen realm in the same way a Roman triumph was visible to an entire city. Peter writes that Christ went and preached to the imprisoned spirits beings confined since the days of Noah when they disobeyed. The connection to Enoch's watchers, imprisoned after the pre-flood judgment, is not invented by fringe commentators. It is discussed in peer-reviewed biblical scholarship at institutions including Durham University, Wheaton College, and the University of Notre Dame. Michael Heiser, a scholar with a PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, spent years documenting precisely this connection in published academic and popular works before his death in 2023. The honest narrator has to stop here and say something uncomfortable. Sitting with these texts, with Enoch, with Matthew 27, with Peter's imprisoned spirits, with Paul's cosmic disarmament, produces a kind of vertigo, not because the information is unstable. It is well documented, but because it raises the possibility that Western Christianity, for all its depth and history and genuine theological achievement, has been reading the resurrection through a lens that was deliberately narrowed in the 4th century by decisions that were institutional, not spiritual. That is not a comfortable thought. It does not lead to easy conclusions. It does not mean everything Western Christians believe is wrong. It means the picture is larger than the frame most people were handed. The Gospel of Matthew records that at the moment of the resurrection, tombs opened and holy people rose and walked into Jerusalem and appeared to many. That verse has been in every Bible for 2,000 years. Most people read past it. Most preachers skip it. Most study Bibles offer a tentative note and move on. In the Ethiopian interpretive framework, where the resurrection is a cosmic boundary event that reverberates through the unseen realm, that verse is not strange. It is the expected signature of what just happened. When the ultimate power over death is broken at its root, the reversal is not contained to one tomb. It ripples. The Book of Enoch, preserved in Ethiopic manuscripts while the Western world lost it for over a millennium, does not rewrite the resurrection story. It gives back the cosmological room the story was always meant to be read inside. And that room is bigger, older, and more documented than almost anyone who clicked on a viral AI headline was expecting to find. The question that remains, the one that cannot be answered by manuscripts or councils or academic papers, is the one that lands in the chest, not the mind. If this background was always real, if the texts were always there, if the Ethiopian Church was always reading a larger Bible while the Western world narrowed its canon in a series of 4th century letters and council decisions, what else is sitting in plain sight, printed on a page that the modern reader has never truly stopped to read? The viral headline was wrong about where the shock would come from. It was not the AI. It was not a machine generating drama from thin air. The shock was already in the texts. It was in Matthew 27. It was in 1 Peter chapter 3. It was in Jude quoting Enoch by name inside canonical scripture. It was in Paul describing the resurrection as a public defeat of cosmic authorities using the vocabulary of the Enochic unseen realm. The shock is that it was always there. Elon Musk's Grok did not discover anything. No AI did. What the question fed into that system did was reflect back a curiosity that millions of people were already carrying a sense that the Bible they grew up with was a partial view of something larger, older, and stranger than they had been told. That sense is historically justified. The documentation is real. The Ethiopian canon is real. The manuscript tradition is real. James Bruce's 1773 recovery of 1 Enoch is real. The scholarly consensus that Jude quotes Enoch is real. The first century Jewish cosmological background to Paul's language about powers and authorities is real. None of it requires exaggeration. None of it needs a fake quote or an invented expert. The verified history is extraordinary enough. Here is the question this documentary leaves with every person watching. What will be done with it? Not as a theological argument, not as ammunition for debate, but as an invitation. An invitation to go back to the text, to Matthew 27, to 1 Peter, to Jude, to Colossians, and read them inside the larger room that the Ethiopian tradition kept open for 1,500 years. The resurrection does not need Enoch to be true, but Enoch helps explain what the first believers understood they were witnessing when they said the tomb was empty. Not just the end of one man's death, the beginning of the reversal of something cosmic, something ancient, something that started in Genesis 6 and moved through centuries of unseen conflict toward a morning in Jerusalem where the ground shook and the stone moved and the boundary between the seen and unseen world broke open in a way that Matthew recorded and almost no one has fully discussed since. That is the real answer the AI pointed toward. Not a shocking secret. A documented mystery sitting in open texts, preserved in an African church, carried in manuscripts that survived when the Western world stopped copying them, waiting for the moment when enough people asked the right question at the same time. That moment is now. If this documentary opens something in the way you think about the Bible, about ancient texts, about what may have been preserved and what may have been quietly set aside, share it. Share it with someone who has never heard the name Enoch, who has never been told the Ethiopian Bible exists, who has read Matthew 27 their entire life and moved past those 2 verses without stopping. Because the next investigation on this channel goes deeper. It moves into the angelic hierarchies described in Enoch, into the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments that confirm the Watcher tradition, into the question of what early Christianity believed about the structure of the universe before the councils standardized what could and could not be taught. Subscribe now. Turn on the notification bell, because these stories do not come back around once you miss them. The texts are old. The questions are urgent. And what has been preserved in Ethiopia, in Qumran, in manuscripts the Western world forgot it lost, is only beginning to come back into view. The most dangerous mystery is not what was hidden from the reader. It is what was always printed on the page and never truly read.